There's something deeply unsettling about watching family members rewrite history right before your eyes. My stepmother, Chidinma 42 and polished to perfection, had a gift for it. For months, I'd watched silently as her small lies snowballed into something far more dangerous. I'm Amara, a 28-year-old professor of African literature, and I pride myself on spotting inconsistencies. It's what made me good at my job. It's also what made me a dangerous witness to her schemes. It all started with insignificant details. A story about who brought the first cake to a family party. The color of the dress someone wore to a wedding 5 years ago. Small distortions that no one would question because, after all, memory is flawed, isn't it? But I have an elephant's memory. Always have. It's a trait that made me a good professor, but also an inconvenient observer of human inconsistencies. The first time I really took notice was during a Sunday lunch at our family compound in Ikeja. Chidinma was sitting at the table, wrapped in expensive gold-toned Ankara fabric that shined brighter than her sincerity. Her jil was tied in elaborate layers that added at least 6 inches to her already imposing stature. She dominated the space the way she always did, with that physical presence that demanded attention, that rehearsed smile she reserved for public moments. "You know," she said, turning to Aunt Ngozi, who was visiting. "Okonkwo's first wife, my late predecessor, came from such modest beginnings. Simple folk, really. No real standing. From some backwater village, if I recall correctly." My fork froze halfway to my plate. My mother, dead 6 years now, came from a family of real substance merchants and educators in Enugu. They'd had libraries when electricity was still a luxury. My grandfather had been one of the first headmasters in the region. I'd grown up on those stories. Simple. The words slipped out of my mouth before I could measure my tone. Chidinma turned to me with that look she had perfected, part innocent surprise, part maternal censure. "Amara, darling, there's nothing wrong with coming from humble beginnings. Your mother, God bless her soul, was always so hard-working despite her circumstances." Aunt Ngozi nodded, absorbing every word as absolute truth. Why would she question it? Chidinma was Chief Okonkwo's current wife, the woman who organized community meetings, who wore fabrics that cost some people's monthly salary. I glanced at my father across the table. Chief Okonkwo 62, distinguished despite the gray at his temples, his hands bearing the honest wear of decades in civil service. His cane rested beside his chair, that polished walking stick only brought out for formal occasions. His eyes, normally sharp as pins, were deliberately studying his plate. Not a word. That's when the first crack appeared. I knew he knew. My father had loved my mother, truly loved her. He'd respected her mind, her education, the quiet dignity that came naturally to her. But here he was, buying peace at the price of truth. I said nothing that day. I just registered it. I observed, like a researcher documenting data for later analysis. The lies continued, small, strategic, always inserted into casual conversations where contradicting would be rude, where questioning would be seen as seeking conflict. The first wife never really understood traditions. "I had to teach everything from scratch when I arrived," Chidinma commented to a neighbor the following week. My mother had been the guardian of our family's ancestral stories. She knew every proverb, every ritual, every cultural nuance that Chidinma now pretended to master. She was a bit, how can I say, detached from practical family matters. Another gem dropped during a visit from a distant cousin. My mother had managed the household finances with mathematical precision, kept meticulous records, had built the small fortune that allowed my father to retire with dignity. Every lie was a little death, a gradual erosion of the woman who raised me, who taught me that truth matters, that integrity is non-negotiable. And I watched my mother being rewritten, line by line, until she became unrecognizable. But why? That was the question that kept me awake at night. Why did Chidinma need to diminish a dead woman? What threat could a memory pose to her? I started looking for patterns. Like a good academic, I did what I do best. I researched, documented, analyzed. I noticed that the lies always had witnesses. They were always spoken in front of people outside the immediate family. They were always framed in such a way that contradicting them would look like a resentful daughter obsessively defending an idealized mother. It was ingenious, really. A public relations strategy worthy of study. 3 months after that first lunch, on a rainy afternoon in Lagos when the sky was as gray as my mood, I found myself alone in the family compound. My father had gone to mediate a land dispute in the community still respected as a wise elder despite being retired. Chidinma was at one of her community meetings, likely planting more seeds of her revised narrative. The rain beat hard against the zinc roof, creating that sound that always reminded me of my childhood. My mother used to say that rain washed away lies and revealed truths. In the Igbo tradition she cherished, water was purifying, revealing. My feet carried me to the ancestral room. Every traditional family has one, that sacred space where memories are kept, where the departed still reside through photographs and personal effects. My mother's photograph was there, framed in dark mahogany, her at 35, smiling with that quiet confidence that was her trademark. Natural hair styled in an elegant afro, eyes that seemed to see right through pretenses. "Mother," I whispered, "she is erasing you, and I don't know why." That was when I saw it. In the corner of the room, on a wooden shelf that had gathered dust, were stacks of old notebooks, family records my mother kept meticulously. I knew they existed. I'd seen her writing in them as a child, but I had never thought to look for them after her death. The pain had been too great. But now, with Chidinma's lies echoing in my head, I felt a compulsion I couldn't ignore. I picked up the oldest notebook. My mother's handwriting, so familiar it made my heart ache, filled the pages. Dates, events, family stories. And then, in the middle notebooks, I found the family ledger. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. It was all there, documented in meticulous detail. My mother's family tree, going back 4 generations. They weren't simple people from a small village. They were established merchants, pioneer educators. One had even been a counselor to the king in pre-colonial times. There were copies of education certificates my grandfather had studied at universities when most men were illiterate. Property records, ancestral lands in Enugu that were passed down from generation to generation. Ancestral lands. The words pulsed in my mind like a war drum. My mother had come from a landed family. Lands that would technically pass to me, as the only daughter. Lands that Chidinma had no right to, no access to, no claim on. Unless my mother's lineage was questioned. Unless it was established that she came from humble origins, from a simple family, with no real property to pass on. The rain kept falling, but I didn't hear it anymore. All I heard was the blood pounding in my ears as the truth, terrible and clear, crystallized. Chidinma's lies weren't about personal insecurity. They weren't about competing with a memory. They were about rewriting history to rewrite inheritance rights. They were about stealing a legacy under the guise of casual social revision. And my father. My father remained silent while this happened. His elder's staff, a symbol of authority and truth, was useless if he didn't use it to defend what was right. I sat in that ancestral room, holding my mother's ledger against my chest with her photograph watching me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless. I felt armed. Because now I had more than memories. I had proof. I had documentation that no well-rehearsed lie could contradict. I had the truth in my hands, written in the meticulous handwriting of a woman who valued precision above all else. But the question remained, growing in intensity with every beat of my heart. What would I do with this truth? Confronting Chidinma immediately would be satisfying but futile. She was a master at deflecting, at playing the victim, at making any confrontation seem like an unfair attack. I needed strategy, not impulse. And then I remembered the big family reunion was coming up. In 2 weeks, the extended family would gather to celebrate my father's eldest brother's 70th birthday. Cousins from distant cities, uncles and aunts I hadn't seen in years, community elders. Everyone would be there, including people who had known my mother, who had known her family, who knew the truth. A slow smile formed on my lips. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who has just seen the chessboard clearly for the first time. Chidinma had built her house of lies carefully, brick by brick, in private conversations and subtle insinuations. But houses built on lies have weak foundations. And I was about to shake those foundations until everything crumbled. I put the ledger back on the shelf, but I photographed every relevant page with my phone. In African literature, we teach that oral tradition is powerful, but written documentation is eternal. My mother knew that. That was why she kept records. I stood up, dusted off my clothes, and faced my mother's portrait one last time. In the gray light, her eyes seemed to glow, or maybe I just needed them to. I could almost hear her voice, quoting that Igbo proverb she'd lived by. Eziokwu bundu. Truth is life. Mother, I whispered, I will restore your honor. I promise. The rain began to subside, and as I left that ancestral room, carrying the truth in my heart and on my phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Determination. Because Chidinma had underestimated one fundamental thing about me. I was my mother's daughter. And my mother had taught me that the truth, however uncomfortable, always deserves to be defended. That silence in the face of injustice is complicity. That patience is not weakness when it is strategic. 2 weeks to prepare. To plan meticulously. To make sure that when I spoke, every single word would land like a hammer. Chidinma was rewriting our family's story, but she'd forgotten one crucial thing. Every story has a climax, and I was about to deliver the one she never saw coming. The family gathering was going to be interesting. Very interesting. Because while Chidinma would arrive draped in her expensive fabrics, carrying her fake authority and her well-rehearsed lies, I would arrive with something far more powerful. I would arrive with the truth. 2 weeks can feel like an eternity when you're holding a secret that burns in the palm of your hand. Every day that passed since that rain in the ancestral room was a test of patience, of strategy, of silent strength. I hadn't just discovered the truth about my mother. I had discovered something much more revealing about Chidinma. That she wasn't just a liar. She was methodical, patient, and extremely ambitious. But she had underestimated one fundamental thing. I was my mother's daughter, and my mother had taught me that wisdom doesn't scream, it observes. That truth doesn't need haste, it needs time. The family gathering would take place at our compound in Ikeja, on a Saturday afternoon when the sun punishes Lagos without mercy. Aunts, uncles, cousins, community elders, everyone would come. It was one of those traditional gatherings where family matters are discussed, where legacies are honored, where stories are told and passed down. Chidinma had orchestrated it all. The date, the guest list, the menu, everything. She moved through the compound like royalty surveying her domain, her head wrap catching the light, her expensive fabrics announcing her presence with every step. "Amara, my dear," she called out to me the morning of the gathering, her voice dripping with that fake honey I knew all too well. "Make sure the ancestral room is tidy. I want to show the elders how much I care for this family's traditions." How much she cares. As if those traditions hadn't existed decades before she ever set foot in this house. "Of course, Chidinma," I replied, my voice calm as still water. "I'll ensure everything is in order." She gave me that smile that didn't reach her eyes, that smile that said she thought she had won, that I had become docile, submissive, that I had finally accepted my place in her version of our family history. If only she knew. While tidying the ancestral room, my eyes landed on my mother's photograph. Her eyes seemed to follow me, as they always did. And I whispered softly where no one could hear. "Today, Mother. Today your honor begins to be restored." People started arriving around 3 in the afternoon. Uncle Emeka with his loud laugh. Aunt Ngozi with her endless stories. Elders Mazi Obi and Mama Adaeze, whose blessings commanded respect in the community. Cousins I hadn't seen in months. The house filled with voices, with life, with a human warmth that went beyond the stifling heat of Lagos. And at the center of it all, as always, was Chidinma. She moved among the guests with studied grace, offering drinks, cracking jokes, touching arms, building that carefully crafted image of the benevolent matriarch, of the guardian of traditions, of the second wife who honored the first. My father, Chief Okonkwo, was seated in his usual chair in the central courtyard, his traditional cane resting by his side. He watched everything with those attentive eyes that people often underestimated. Since my mother died, he had become quieter, more withdrawn, as if a part of him had been buried with her. But I knew my father. I knew the glint in his eyes when something caught his attention. I knew the way his fingers tapped lightly on his cane when he was processing information. I knew the man hiding behind that silence. The question was he seeing what I was seeing? Or had Chidinma managed to fool him too? Come, come, Chidinma called everyone to sit in the central courtyard, where chairs and benches had been arranged in a semicircle. Let's begin. We have much to celebrate and discuss today. I sat quietly off to the side, in a position where I could observe every face, where I could see the reactions, where I could gauge the room. First, Chidinma began, her voice assuming that formal tone she used when she wanted to sound important. I want to thank everyone for coming. This family, the Okonkwo family, is blessed. And today, I want us to remember our roots, to honor those who came before us. Beautiful words. Empty words coming from lips that lied so easily. Chief Okonkwo, she continued, turning to my father with performative deference, has built so much in this life. And I, as his wife, feel honored to help preserve the legacy of this house. Maziobi, one of the elders, nodded approvingly. Aunt Ngozi murmured something about how Chidinma was a blessing. I saw how she collected these approvals like trophies, adding them to her armor of false legitimacy. And then she did what I knew she would do, what I was waiting for. The reason I spent 2 weeks in silence, allowing her to feel safe enough to take the next step. You know, Chidinma continued, her voice dropping, becoming almost confessional, as if she were sharing some sacred confidence, that I've always had nothing but respect for Chief Okonkwo's first wife. God bless her soul. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. But I think it is important, especially for the younger ones present here, she continued, her eyes sweeping the group but carefully avoiding mine, that we understand the full truth of our family history, that we do not idealize the past in ways that distort reality. My heart started beating faster, but my face remained a mask of calm, observation, patience. The first wife, Chidinma paused, as if searching for the right words, though she'd clearly rehearsed this 1,000 times, came from a very humble background. Good people, naturally, but without education or property, without the refinement that a family like the Okonkwos needs. It felt like the floor dropped away beneath me. She was doing it, actually doing it, in front of everyone. I'm not saying this to belittle anyone, Chidinma continued, her voice dripping with fake compassion. But the truth is the truth. She was a good woman within her limitations, but her family, well, let's just say Chief Okonkwo was extraordinarily generous to marry her. He elevated her, gave her a status she would never have known otherwise. Auntie Ngozi looked uncomfortable. Uncle Emeka stared at his hands, but no one spoke, no one challenged her, because Chidinma had carefully built her credibility over 3 years, because she knew exactly how to wrap poison in gift paper. In fact, and here her voice became even firmer, more authoritative, her family had a questionable reputation in the village they came from. They were known for, how can I say this delicately, for not honoring commitments, for being, let's say, dishonest in business dealings. Dishonest. She had called my mother's family dishonest. My mother, whose photograph was just a few feet away, in the ancestral room, whose integrity was legendary among everyone who knew her, whose family owned land dating back generations, recorded in documents I now carried on my phone. Chidinma, Mazi Obi's voice cut through the air. These are serious accusations about the dead. Are you sure about this? For a moment, just a moment, I saw a flicker of something on her face. Uncertainty? Fear. But she hid it quickly behind that confident smile. Mazi Obi, with all due respect, I only speak the truth. Ask anyone from her village. They will confirm it. Her family had nothing. No land, no reputation, It was Chief Okonkwo who— She paused dramatically. Who saved her honor by marrying her. Silence. I could feel people's eyes shifting toward me, waiting, wanting to see how the daughter would react to hearing her mother slandered like this, to hearing her family legacy trampled on. And that was when something extraordinary happened. I smiled. Not a big smile. Not something obvious. But a small smile that touched just the corners of my lips. The kind of smile my mother used to give when she knew something others didn't, when she held the truth like a precious secret. Amara, Chidinma finally turned to me, her voice soft but with an edge of challenge. You are young. Perhaps you don't know all these stories about your mother's family, but it is important that you know the truth, so you can understand your proper place in this family. My proper place. As if I were an intruder. As if Okonkwo blood didn't run in my veins. All eyes were on me now, waiting. The daughter confronted with the brutal truth about her humble origins. The moment where I should shrink away. Accept it. Bow my head in shame. I met her eyes and held my ground. Chidinma, I said quietly, my voice steady, carrying an authority that didn't need to be loud. That's quite a narrative. They aren't stories, she retorted quickly, her tone becoming slightly defensive. They are facts. Facts, I repeated, as if savoring the word. Yes, facts are important, aren't they? Very important. Something flashed across her face. Confusion. She had expected tears, anger, emotional denial that would make me look defensive and, therefore, guilty. She didn't expect calm. She didn't expect this smile. Do you have something to say, Amara? Maziobi asked, his voice gentle but curious. For a moment, just a moment, I considered it. I could do this right now. I could pull out my phone. I could show the photographs of the land documents. I could prove, here and now, that every word that came out of Chidinma's mouth was a calculated lie. But something stopped me. Something my mother had taught me about strategy, about giving people enough rope to hang themselves with their own lies. Because if Chidinma was lying about this, about something so easily verifiable, what else was she lying about? And why? What was the bigger game she was playing? No, sir, I replied, keeping my eyes on Chidinma. Not right now. Not yet. Those two words were a promise. I saw Chidinma relax. Just slightly. She thought she had won. That I was accepting it. That the sheep had been tamed. Very wise of you, child, she said, turning her poisonous smile back to me. It's good to accept the truth, even when it hurts. The meeting continued. Other matters were discussed. Plans for a cousin's wedding. Questions about family lands that needed resolution. The normal life of a large Nigerian family dealing with its normal affairs. But something had changed. I could feel it. The looks coming my way held pity now. As if I were less. As if my lineage had been diminished in their eyes. And Chidinma? Chidinma was glowing. She had achieved what she wanted. Planting the seed of doubt. Redefining the narrative. Establishing herself as the superior wife. The one who brought true class to this family. Throughout the entire meeting, my father remained quiet, observing. His cane rested beside him. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest of the chair. As people began to disperse, seeking food and drink, walking around the courtyard, I got up to go to the ancestral room. I needed a moment. Just a moment away from the pitying glances, away from Chidinma's radiant triumph. But as I passed my father's chair, I felt his hand lightly touch my arm. Amara. His voice was low, for my ears alone. I turned to him, and for a brief second, our eyes met. There was something there. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. A glimmer. A spark of recognition. He said nothing more. Just that touch. That look. And then he let go of me and turned his attention back to the guests. But it was enough. Enough to tell me that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. In the ancestral room, I looked again at my mother's photograph. The afternoon cast long shadows across the room, making her eyes seem alive. Vigilant. She hung herself with her own rope, Mother, I whispered. She lied about something verifiable. About land. About reputation. About things that left documented trails. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photographs I had taken. Land ownership documents from my mother's family, dating back to 1947. Certificates of honor awarded to my grandfather for community service. Records of marriages, baptisms, commercial transactions, all meticulously preserved. My mother's family was not dishonest, not propertyless, not without reputation. This was everything Chidinma had just publicly denied, and I had the proof. But the question burning inside me was no longer just about restoring my mother's honor. It was bigger, more urgent. Why was Chidinma doing this? Why now? Why did she need to publicly establish that my mother's family was dishonest and without property? There was a bigger game being played here, and I needed to understand what it was before showing my cards. Because if there's one thing my mother taught me, it's that the truth is most powerful when it comes at the right time. When it destroys not just a lie, but an entire structure of lies. Chidinma had just given me a gift. She had lied publicly, in front of witnesses, about verifiable facts. She had created expectations, built a narrative. And the higher you build with lies, the more devastating the fall when the truth arrives. I could wait. I could observe. I could let her feel safe, victorious, unquestionable. Because I knew something she didn't know. That I had documents. That I had proof. That I had the truth on my side. And more importantly, I had patience. Patience to wait for the right moment. For the moment where a single revealed truth would not just embarrass her, but completely destroy the credibility she had spent 3 years building. Ezioku bundu, I whispered, repeating my mother's proverb. Truth is life. And Chidinma was about to discover what happens when you build your life on lies. From the courtyard, I heard her laughter. Loud, confident, victorious. Let her laugh, I thought. Let her believe she won. Because while she celebrated her victory, I was doing something far more dangerous. I was observing, documenting, connecting dots. And when my time to speak finally came, every word I said would carry the weight of undeniable truth. Chidinma had declared war on my mother's memory, on my family's legacy, on my own honor. She just didn't know yet that she had declared a war she couldn't win. Because the truth, however long it takes to emerge, always finds a way to come to light. And I would be the lantern that illuminated it. Truth is life. Ezioku bundu. My mother's words echoed in my mind as I watched Chidinma from across the courtyard, her laughter still cutting through the humid Lagos afternoon air like a sharp blade. She didn't know. She had no idea that, while celebrating her victory, I was doing something far more dangerous than confronting her at that moment. I was waiting, watching, letting her believe she had won. My mother had a proverb she'd quote when I was little. The person who eats in a hurry swallows the bones. Chidinma was rushing to rewrite our history, rushing to erase my mother, rushing to claim a position she hadn't earned. But rushing means mistakes, and mistakes leave evidence. That night, after the guests had left, I pretended to read in the living room while Chidinma and my father talked in his office. The door was slightly open enough to hear them. "Okonkwo," Chidinma's voice came through, sweetly poisonous. "We need to talk about the land situation." My whole body froze. Land. The word hung in the air like smoke. What land? My father's voice sounded tired. It always sounded tired lately. The ancestral lands of Enugu. The lands that belonged to your first wife's family. My first wife. Not even her name. As if my mother was just a temporary position now permanently filled by Chidinma. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I forced myself to remain still, to keep listening. What about the Enugu lands? My father seemed genuinely confused. Well, Chidinma paused, and I could perfectly imagine her expression. That carefully calibrated smile she wore when she was about to present something outrageous, as if it were perfectly reasonable. As you know, her family didn't have much in terms of real property. Humble people, manual laborers, as I mentioned today. Those lands in Enugu didn't actually come from her side of the family. They came from your grandfather, didn't they? A lie, An absolute, barefaced lie. The lands in Enugu had belonged to my mother's family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather had cultivated that land, built the first brick house on that plot, planted the coconut trees that still yield fruit to this day. I had visited those lands every summer of my childhood, had run barefoot over that red soil, listened to the stories of the elders under the shade of those trees. And now Chidinma was sitting in my father's office, rewriting even this. "I don't think," my father began, but Chidinma interrupted him gently. "You might not remember every detail, it's been decades. But I've spoken to several people who knew your parents, and they all agree. The lands came from the Okonkwo side originally, which means," she paused meaningfully, "that technically, as your wife, I'd have legitimate claim to administer those properties." There was a long silence. I held my breath. "Chidinma," my father finally spoke, and there was something in his voice. Not exactly anger, not exactly suspicion, but not agreement either. "Those lands were left to Amara, in her mother's will." "Ah, yes, the will." Chidinma laughed lightly, as if discussing something trivial. "But wills can be contested, can't they? Especially when based on false premises regarding the origin of the properties. I'm not saying we should do that immediately, of course, but it would be sensible to have things clarified legally, for everyone's peace of mind. Don't you think?" There was no answer from my father. Just heavy, dense silence. "Anyway," Chidinma continued, her voice lighter now, as if she had already planted the seed she wanted to plant. "We don't need to decide anything tonight. Just something for us to consider. For the good of the family. For the good of the family." As if stealing her stepdaughter's inheritance was an act of kindness. I heard the sound of my father's chair creaking as he stood up. "It's late. Let's go to sleep." Quickly, I grabbed my book and pretended to be absorbed in reading as they left the office. Chidinma passed by me without a glance, already heading up the stairs. But my father stopped. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something. His eyes met mine. There was something there. Weariness, yes. But also, what? Guilt? Confusion? Or perhaps just the exhaustion of a man who has lost a wife and was now slowly losing control of his own home. "Good night, Amara," he said finally, his voice soft. "Good night, Dad." And then he went up too, leaving me alone in the living room with the weight of what I had just heard. Lands. She was after the lands. It all fell into place. The lies about my mother's family weren't personal. They were calculated. Strategic. If Chidinma could convince people that my mother's side had no real standing, no property, no honor, then she could claim the lands had never belonged to them in the first place. It was simple theft, dressed up in legal language. And my father, God help me, my father was so submerged in his own grief and weariness that he couldn't even see what was happening right under his nose. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds of Lagos, distant horns, the neighbor's generator humming, the occasional dog bark. And I planned, because now I understood. It wasn't enough to simply prove that Chidinma was lying about trivial details of family history. I needed to document everything. Every lie, every distortion, every carefully constructed manipulation. I needed to build a case so solid, so indisputable, that when the moment finally came to speak, there would be no room for debate. In the following days, I became a shadow in my own home, watching, listening, taking mental notes of every conversation, every interaction, every moment Chidinma planted yet another seed of her false narrative. I visited the ancestral room when she wasn't home, the small room at the back of the house where we kept family photos, old documents, objects from past generations. My mother had always kept that room impeccably organized. Every document in its place, every photograph cataloged and dated. Chidinma never went in there. To her, it was just a dusty room full of dead people's old stuff. But to me, it was a treasure trove, a living archive of our truth. I found the deeds to the Enugu lands, dated 1946. My great-grandfather's name, clear as day, in the faded ink. The transfer to my grandfather in 1972. And then, to my mother in 1995. 3 generations. Documented. Indisputable. I photographed every page with my phone. Saved the files in 3 different places. Cloud, external hard drive, and I even printed physical copies that I hid in places Chidinma would never think to look. I found old photographs. My mother still a child, standing in front of the brick house in Enugu, her father beside her. Photographs of harvest festivals on those lands. Documents showing property taxes paid year after year by my mother's family. Every piece of evidence was like a weapon I was carefully polishing and storing for the right moment. But it wasn't just documents I was collecting. It was witnesses too. I called my mother's cousin still living in Enugu, 73 years old, with the kind of memory that never forgets a detail. I recorded her, with permission, as she told me everything. The land's history, names of everyone who'd lived there, the ceremonies held under those trees. "Why are you asking this?" she said when we finished. "Why now?" "Someone's trying to erase our history, Auntie, and I'm not letting that happen." There was a moment of silence. Then, "Your mother would be proud. Eziokubund, truth is life." The same words, the same proverb. Meanwhile, Chidinma continued her campaign. At every family gathering, every social event, she wove her narrative a little further. Always subtly, always with that smile, always framed as if she were just sharing innocent memories. Oh yes, my predecessor's family were such simple people, honest workers, of course, but without much education or property. And I let her speak. I smiled politely. I nodded when appropriate. I never confronted her. I never gave the slightest indication that I knew exactly what she was doing. Because there is another proverb I learned. Not from my mother this time, but from my literature professor at university. Give someone enough rope, and they will hang themselves. Chidinma was asking for rope, and I was happy to provide it. 3 weeks after that conversation in my father's office, Chidinma made her move. It was a Sunday afternoon. The family was gathered for lunch, as we did every month. Uncles, aunts, cousins, all gathered in the large courtyard, eating jollof rice and roast chicken, laughing and talking. Chidinma waited until everyone was relaxed, satisfied with food and good company. Then, with the delicacy of a snake sliding through the grass, she brought up the subject. "Okonkwo and I have been discussing," she began, projecting her voice to ensure everyone at the main table could hear. "With all the land disputes in the courts these days, it makes sense to get our family affairs in order. Everything properly documented. No confusion." People listened politely. "Especially," she continued, "the ancestral properties, the lands in Enugu, for example. We want to be certain that everything is absolutely clear regarding their origin and proper ownership." I felt my heart race, but I kept my face carefully neutral. My father frowned. "The lands in Enugu are perfectly clear, Chidinma. They are in my wife's will, left to Amara." Yes, of course." Chidinma waved her hand as if agreeing completely. "But what I am saying is that we must correctly document the origins. For posterity. So there is no confusion for future generations." My uncle Amika, a retired lawyer, leaned in. "What kind of confusion are you worried about, Chidinma?" She smiled that rehearsed, perfect smile. "No real confusion, uncle. Just wanting clarity. Some of the elders mentioned that the Enugu lands might have originally belonged to the Okonkwo side, not my late predecessor's family. If that's true, we should document it properly." Silence fell over the table. Uncle Amika looked at my father. "Is that true, Okonkwo?" My father looked completely lost. No, I always understood that the lands belonged to my wife's family." "Memories can be misleading," Chidinma said softly, "especially after so long. That is why I am suggesting we call a community meeting. A proper gathering with the elders of Enugu who can testify to the true history of these lands. That way we can resolve any ambiguity once and for all." She looked around the table, her face the picture of reason and appropriate concern. "I am sure we all agree that the truth is what matters, no matter what our personal assumptions may be. The truth is what matters." She had the audacity to use those words, to appropriate the value my mother had lived by, and use it as a weapon to steal her daughter's inheritance. I watched the faces around the table, the confusion, the uncertainty, the slow nodding of heads as people started to think that yes, perhaps a community meeting was a good idea. Just to be sure. Just for clarity. And I realized, with a cold, hard clarity, that if I did nothing, if I let this meeting happen on Chidinma's terms, she would win. She would bring bought witnesses. She would present her well-rehearsed version of the story. And my father, lost in his grief and exhaustion, might very well believe her. My mother's lands would be stolen. Her name would be tarnished. Her memory would be rewritten. Unless I did something. "I think it's an excellent idea," I heard myself say, my voice calm and clear. All eyes turned to me. Chidinma blinked, clearly surprised. She had expected resistance, expected me to object. But I was smiling. A smile just as polite and pleasant as hers. "A community meeting is exactly what we need," I continued. "So that the truth about our family, about my mother's inheritance, about everything, can finally be told. Completely. Without ambiguity." There was something in my tone, some weight I put on the word truth, that made Chidinma hesitate. For a moment, just a moment, I saw uncertainty cross her face. But then her smile returned. Because after all, why should she worry? I was just a young university lecturer. She was the chief's wife. She had connections, resources, the confidence that she could mold any narrative to her advantage. She didn't know about the documents I had collected, the photographs, the witness recordings, the careful, meticulous archive of truth I had built over weeks. She didn't know that, while she was busy weaving her web of lies, I was building a fortress of facts. "Wonderful," Chidinma said, her voice practically overflowing with false satisfaction. "So, it's decided. I will organize the meeting. I will invite the appropriate elders. We will do this properly, with all the dignity such a matter deserves." I nodded. "Indeed. With all due dignity." My father looked at me, clear confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand why I was agreeing so readily. He didn't know that I was about to do something he didn't have the courage to do. Defend the truth, no matter the cost. That night, after everyone had left, I returned to my room and opened my laptop. I went through the files I had collected. Every document, every photograph, every audio recording. It was all true, all verifiable, all indisputable. And in 2 weeks, when Chidinma called her community meeting, thinking she was consolidating her victory, I would be ready. Not just to defend my mother's memory, not just to protect my inheritance, but to do something much more important. To show that the truth, no matter how buried, no matter how obscured by carefully constructed lies, always, always finds a way to emerge. Eziokwu bundu. The truth is life. And Chidinma was about to discover that you cannot build a life on lies without everything eventually crumbling. From downstairs, I heard her laughter again. Loud, confident, victorious. Let her laugh, I thought. Let her believe her community meeting will be her moment of triumph. Because when my moment to speak arrived, every word I said would carry the weight of 3 generations of truth. And no amount of charm, manipulation, or well-dressed lies could stand against it. The meeting was set. The stage was prepared. And I, the silent daughter Chidinma had so completely underestimated, was about to show that there's a big difference between being quiet and being weak. My mother taught me that truth is life. Chidinma was about to learn that lies are death, and death eventually always catches up to those who invite it. But the truth, I discovered in those 2 weeks, also comes at a cost. And the highest price wasn't the confrontation with Chidinma. It was the possibility of being alone when the smoke cleared. The first 2 days after the community meeting was scheduled were a careful dance of preparation. I organized my documents in chronological order. My mother's birth certificate, proving her lineage from the Nwosu family, respected throughout the region for 3 generations. The deeds to the ancestral land, with my mother's name clearly registered as the rightful heir. The church records, showing her parents' marriage blessed by the archbishop. Every paper, every seal, every signature a silent witness against Chidinma's lies. I laid them out on my living room table every night, spreading them like a general studying a battlefield. Because that's what it would be. A battle. And battles, I knew, always have casualties. The question was I willing to be one of them? On the third day, Chidinma began her own campaign. I saw her in the market, surrounded by 3 of the most influential women in our neighborhood. Her gel was too elaborate for a Thursday morning, all wrapped in layers of golden fabric that reflected the sunlight like a crown. Her laughter sounded artificial, rehearsed, the kind of sound she produced when she was working to convince someone of something. I stood behind a fruit stall, watching. "The meeting will be an opportunity to finally bring clarity," she was saying, her voice projecting to ensure everyone nearby could hear. "There are so many conflicting stories about our family history. It is time to establish the truth." The truth. The word sounded obscene coming from her mouth. One of the women, Mama Adaze, leaned in closer. "And Chief Okonkwo? Will he speak as well?" Chidinma smiled, and there was something triumphant in that smile that made my stomach knot. "My husband is a man of wisdom. He understands that family peace sometimes requires that certain uncomfortable truths be acknowledged." Certain uncomfortable truths. She was referring to her lies as truth, and she was implying that my father would support them. I bought my mangoes without a word and walked away. But those words haunted me the entire walk back home. That night, I tried to talk to my father. I found him in the ancestral room, sitting in the wooden rocking chair that had belonged to his own father. My mother's photo was on the wall above him, her gentle eyes looking down just as they always did. He held his traditional walking stick in both hands, his fingers tracing the carved patterns that told the story of our lineage. "Father," I began, my voice soft. "About the meeting." He didn't look up. "Chidinma is planning to present her version of the family history," I continued. "Her version where Mom came from a dishonorable family, where the ancestral land shouldn't be in her name, where—" "I know what Chidinma plans," he interrupted, his voice as tired as I had ever heard it. I waited. The silence stretched between us like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. "And you're going to let her?" I finally asked. He sighed, a sound so deep it seemed to come from a place inside him where pain lived permanently. "Peace comes at a price, Amara. Your mother understood that." My mother. He always spoke of her in terms of peace, as if her greatest quality was stillness. As if the fact that she never confronted, never fought, never demanded, was some kind of sacred virtue. But my mother also taught me that peace built on lies was no peace at all. It was just silence with anger underneath. "Mom also understood the truth," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "And she wouldn't have allowed her memory to be tarnished by lies." Finally, he looked at me. His eyes were red, weary. "You're young, Amara. You think the truth fixes everything, but sometimes the truth just breaks things that can't be fixed." "And lies?" I challenged. "Do lies fix anything?" He didn't answer. He just turned his gaze back to my mother's photograph, and I knew the conversation was over. I left the ancestral room feeling as if the ground had been pulled out from under my feet. He wasn't going to support me. Worse, he might actually support Chidinma, all in the name of this phantom peace he valued more than the truth itself. The following days were a kind of torture. I saw Chidinma preparing, talking to visitors, rehearsing her stories. I saw her measuring the size of the community hall, planning where each person would sit, orchestrating every detail as if it were a theatrical production. And I saw my father, silent, watching, but never speaking. 2 nights before the meeting, Chidinma had dinner with us for the first time in weeks. She was radiant, practically glowing with anticipation. She served food to my father with exaggerated attention, asked about his health, laughed at things that weren't funny. I was invisible at that table, a ghost in the house where I grew up. "Chief," she said while pouring more water into his glass, "I am so grateful that you will be there on Thursday. Your presence will give the meeting the weight it needs. When people see you there, they'll know that what is being said has your blessing." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Your blessing. She was publicly declaring that he supported her version. And my father? He simply nodded. A small nod, but it was enough. Chidinma smiled as if she had just won a war. I put my fork down on the plate. The sound echoed through the dining room. "Excuse me," I murmured, standing up. Neither of them stopped me. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, documents scattered around me. All the evidence I needed, irrefutable proof. But proof, I realized, was useless if the person whose validation you needed most refused to see it. My mother smiled at me from the small photograph on my nightstand. 28 years since she left, and there were still moments when I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting right next to me. "Truth is life, my daughter," she used to say. "And life always, eventually, proves itself." But what if life didn't get the chance? What if the lies settled so deep they became the new accepted truth? What if I was completely alone in this? On the morning of the meeting, I woke before dawn. My body was tense, every muscle primed for a battle my mind wasn't yet sure it wanted to fight. I dressed with care, a traditional wrapper in deep blue, the color my mother always said represented truth and the sky. Simple braids, no ornamentation. I wasn't trying to impress. I was preparing for war. I packed the documents into a leather briefcase that had belonged to my grandfather. Every paper carefully organized, every piece of evidence cataloged. My armor made of paper and ink and truth. When I came downstairs, Chidinma was already dressed. And what an outfit. Her ankara was vibrant green and gold, so elaborate it must have cost months' worth of salary. Her jewel towered above her, adding nearly 8 inches to her height. She wore necklaces that jingled when she moved, rings on every finger, earrings that caught the light. She was dressed for victory. Our eyes met for a brief moment. And in that look, I saw everything I needed to know. She thought she had won. She had my father's backing, the stage was set, and the community was primed to believe her version. I was just a minor obstacle, easily discarded, easily silenced. She smiled at me, a small, private smile. The kind of smile that said, "You lost, and we both know it." I didn't smile back. I just gripped my document folder tighter. We arrived at the community hall early, but it was already filling up. The market women, the elders of the land council, young people too, curious about the drama they'd heard whispers of. The room buzzed with expectant chatter. Chidinma circulated like a queen, greeting people, touching arms, laughing that artificial laugh she reserved for public performances. I sat in the front, my folder on my lap, and waited. When my father entered, the room went quiet. Chief Okonkwo commanded respect simply by existing. His cane struck the wooden floor with every step, marking a rhythm that seemed older than any of us. He passed me without a glance. He went straight to the main chair, the one reserved for the head of the family during important meetings. And then, in a move that made my heart sink to my stomach, Chidinma sat down beside him. Not in the women's section where it would be appropriate, but right next to him, in the seat of honor, like a co-leader. He didn't move her, didn't protest, just allowed it. The room noticed. I could see it in their eyes. If he allowed her to sit there, he supported her. If he supported her, her version was the truth. And me? I was sitting in the crowd. Just another voice. No special position. No visible validation. Mama Adaezi opened the meeting with a traditional prayer, asking the ancestors for wisdom and truth. The irony burned in my throat. Then Chidinma stood up. She started slowly, her voice measured and respectful. She spoke about the importance of clarity in family history, about how misunderstandings can create divisions, about her desire only to honor the truth. The truth. That word again, twisted and distorted. Then she began her narrative. How Chief Okonkwo's first wife, my mother, had come from humble circumstances. How her family had been known for financial struggles and social scandals. How the marriage itself had been an act of generosity on Chief Okonkwo's part, elevating a woman of low status. Lies. Every word was a lie. But she told them with such conviction, such apparent certainty, that I could see heads nodding. The story made sense to them. It explained why Chief had remarried so quickly. It made Chidinma not a replacement, but an upgrade. My fingers gripped the edges of the folder so hard my knuckles turned white. And regarding the land in question, Chidinma continued, her voice growing stronger. There is much confusion about proper inheritance. Ancestral land should pass through honorable bloodlines. When there are doubts about that honor. She left the sentence unfinished, letting the implication hang in the air. My mother was dishonorable. Therefore, her claim to the land was invalid. Therefore, Chidinma, as the current wife of appropriate status, had more right. It was brilliant, in a twisted way. She wasn't just rewriting history. She was creating a legal justification for theft. I should stand up. I should interrupt her. But something kept me glued to the chair. My father. He hadn't said a word yet. Just sat there, his face impenetrable, his eyes fixed on some distant point. If I stood up now, without his support, it would be my word against hers. A resentful daughter against a devoted wife. And in our culture, in our community, the word of the head of the family carried absolute weight. If he didn't speak for me, I was alone. Chidinma was reaching the climax of her speech now. Her voice rose, full of fake emotion. All I ever wanted, she said, a hand pressed to her heart, was to honor this family, to bring clarity where there was confusion, to create peace where there was doubt. Peace, confusion, the same words my father had used. She was using his language. She had studied how he thought, how he spoke, and was mirroring it back to the room, to make it look like they were united, that her version was his version. For this reason, she concluded, turning to look directly at my father, I am so grateful for Chief Okonkwo's support and wisdom in these matters. His guidance has been Amara. A single word, my name, spoken by my father. The whole room turned to look at me. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. Was this it? Was he calling me to speak? Or was he silencing me before I could even try? Chidinma looked slightly disturbed, her carefully constructed narrative interrupted. But she recovered quickly, turning to me with an expression of fake kindness. Ah, yes, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps Amara has something to add? As the daughter of the first wife, she might have. Personal perspectives. Personal perspectives. Not facts, not truth. Just the subjective feelings of a possibly resentful daughter. I stood, gripping the folder like armor. The room had gone completely silent, everyone waiting. I looked at my father. Nothing. No sign of encouragement, no warning. Just that careful blankness he'd perfected over the years. I was completely on my own. All the fears I had buried over the last 2 weeks rose to the surface at once. What if no one believed me? What if the documents weren't enough without his validation? What if I destroyed my relationship with my father for nothing? What if his peace was more important than my mother's memory? My mother. I looked at the empty space where her photograph should be. Chidinma had removed all photographs of her from the community room before the meeting. Of course she had. You can't rewrite history when the real person is looking right at you. But I saw her anyway. Her kind eyes, her calm smile, her voice saying, "Truth is life, my daughter." And life, eventually, always proves itself. Even if it's only through a lonely daughter, holding a folder of documents, facing a room full of doubt. Even if it's just that. I opened the folder. The first page was my mother's birth certificate, the Nwosu family seal, clear as day. "I have documents," I said, and to my surprise, my voice was steady. Proof of who my mother really was. Evidence that contradicts everything just said. Chidinma laughed. Actually laughed. A light, almost amused sound. "Documents can be misinterpreted," she said softly. "Especially by those emotionally invested in a particular narrative." Emotionally invested. She was framing my truth as sentimentality, turning solid evidence into the wishful thinking of a grieving daughter. I looked at my father once more. One last time. Waiting. Praying. Silently begging for just a sign. Just a word. Just some indication that I wasn't completely alone in this. He looked back at me and said nothing. His silence was louder than any word Chidinma had spoken. In that moment, I understood. He wasn't going to save me. He wasn't going to validate me. He had chosen his peace over my truth. and I would have to decide if the truth was worth fighting for, even when you are completely alone. Even when the person whose love you need the most refuses to stand by your side. Even when the price of speaking might be losing everything. My fingers tightened around the first document. The room waited. Chidinma smiled. And my father remained silent as death. I started reading. The cruelest lie first, the one where Chidinma had publicly declared that my mother came from a disgraced family. Nothing. No standing. No worth. That marrying her had been an act of charity by my father. The document I read was over 50 years old, yellowed and brittle, but its power hadn't faded. My voice was sharp and clear. We certify that the Okafor family of Enugu holds ancestral rights to farmlands in the northern region, transmitted through 5 generations. Emmanuel Okafor, the current family patriarch, is recognized by the Council of Elders as a man of unquestionable character and a guardian of ancestral traditions. Emmanuel Okafor, my grandfather. The man Chidinma had erased from the narrative entirely. I kept reading. The sparkle in Chidinma's eyes faded a little, but she kept her smile. She still believed she could control this, still thought that words on old paper wouldn't hold weight against her performance. I was just getting started. The second document was a property deed. Ancestral lands my mother had inherited, registered in her name 3 months before she died. Lands Chidinma had tried to claim as if they were part of the marriage's common assets. Lands she planned to transfer to her own name using the narrative that my mother had no legitimate family. When I finished reading that document, I saw Chidinma adjust the gil on her head. A nervous movement disguised as elegance. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished yet. The third document was a letter, written by my mother's own hand, addressed to my father, dated 2 years before her death. In it, my mother expressed concern for the future. She knew she was sick. She knew she might not have much time. And she wrote, with the clarity of someone seeing beyond the present, specific instructions on how to protect her memory and our family's future. May Amara always know her roots. May she understand the Okafor legacy. May she carry our name with pride. And may she never allow anyone to erase who we were. My voice trembled as I read those words, not from fear, from suppressed fury, from fierce love for a woman who was no longer here to defend herself, but who had foreseen exactly what would happen. That was when Chidinma finally spoke. Her voice still had that honeyed tone, but now it carried poorly disguised desperation. Amara, sweetheart, I understand you're upset, that you miss your mother. We all do. She glanced around the room, searching for support in people's faces. But documents like these don't prove anything beyond what we already understand. Your mother was a modest woman. Good-hearted, certainly, but of simple origins. Nothing wrong with that. She was trying. Still trying to shape the narrative, redirect attention, turn my truth into the uncontrolled emotion of an orphaned daughter. I didn't give that room to grow. I'm not finished, I repeated. And this time, my voice cut through any attempt at interruption. The fourth document was a written testimony, signed by 3 elders of the Enugu community, men who knew my grandfather, men who attested to the Okafor family's reputation, the integrity passed down through generations, the respect my mother carried as a natural heritage. When I finished reading, the silence in the room was different. No longer the polite waiting from before. It was the silence of people processing the revelation that they had been deceived, that the story Chidinma had woven with such care was unraveling thread by thread. Chidinma tried again. This time, her voice rose in pitch. Tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. She was good at this, at turning emotion into a tool. How can you do this to me? She brought her hand to her chest, eyes glistening. I tried to be a mother to you. I tried to take you in when your mother passed. And you attack me like this? In front of everyone? It was a classic move. Flip the script. Turn the liar into the victim. Make my search for the truth look like cruelty. But before I could respond, before any word left my mouth, a voice cut the air. Go on, Amara. My father. 3 words. the first he had spoken since the beginning of that meeting. All eyes turned to him. Chidinma froze, tears still glistening but now without a destination. I looked at my father and saw something I had never noticed before. A glint in his eyes, not of anger, not of sadness, something more dangerous, more intentional, satisfaction. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his walking stick. Those weathered hands gripped the polished wood. When he spoke, his voice carried years of silent watching. Go on. Not a request, a command, validation. He wasn't just approving, he was expecting this. In that moment, everything shifted inside me. The weeks of loneliness, the feeling of standing alone, evaporated. My father hadn't been passive. He'd been waiting. Waiting to see if anyone would have the courage to speak. Waiting to see if truth would have a voice. Waiting to know if his daughter had inherited her mother's strength. I did. The fifth document was the most devastating. A record of transactions. Chidinma's attempts to transfer properties that didn't belong to her. Conversations with lawyers about how to contest the inheritance left to me. Printed emails, highlighted dates, evidence she had underestimated because she never imagined anyone was watching. But I was, just like my father. As I read through every documented scheme, every recorded manipulation, Chidinma visibly deflated. The smile vanished. That elaborate head wrap suddenly looked like too much a costume that didn't fit anymore. She turned to my father, searching for the ally she'd thought she'd secured, the man she'd spent years winning over. But my father didn't look back at her. His eyes were on me, and in that look, I saw everything he had never said out loud. All the grief he carried for my mother, all the silent anger against the lies that had stained her memory, all the hope that someone, finally, would have the strength to restore the truth. I finished reading the last document. My voice was steady now, without a tremor. The final words echoed in the room like a sentence. These are Chidinma's documented attempts to erase my mother's history and steal our ancestral inheritance. These are not interpretations. These are not misunderstandings. They are facts. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children playing in the yard seemed to have stopped, as if feeling the weight of the moment through the walls. Chidinma opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. All her tools of manipulation, all the rehearsed tears, all the calculated smiles had lost their power. Faced with paper, ink, and documented truth, her performance had no room to exist. Uncle Emeka, my father's older brother and one of the community's respected elders, broke the silence. His voice was deep with authority earned through 7 decades of life. Chidinma. No affectionate title, no sister or brother's wife. Just her name, bare and unadorned. Do you have anything to say? She tried. God knows she tried. Tears welled up again, but now they seemed too manufactured, too desperate. I just wanted to protect this family. I just wanted us to be united. By lying? Uncle Emeka's voice was sharp as a blade. By erasing a dead woman's memory? By trying to steal lands that were never yours? There was no answer possible. She knew it. We all knew it. Another relative spoke up, then another. One by one, those who had believed her stories, who had accepted the narrative constructed with such care, began to question. They began to see. They began to understand that they had been tools in a lie that had lasted for years. And in the center of it all, my father remained seated, silent again. But now his silence was different. It wasn't absence. It was total presence. It was the silence of a man witnessing justice being served. Chidinma made one last attempt, turning to my father, her voice cracking, though I couldn't tell if it was genuine or performed. Okonkwo. You're going to let her do this? Let her destroy me publicly? My father finally looked at her. Really looked at her. Maybe for the first time in years. When he spoke, his voice held the weight of everything he'd never said. I won't allow anyone to destroy the truth. The truth is that you tried to erase a woman I loved. You tried to steal from my daughter what belonged to her. You tried to rewrite our history as if I was blind. He paused, his eyes intensifying. But I wasn't blind. I always knew. I was waiting to see if anyone would have the strength to speak. And in that moment, I understood everything. His passivity was never weakness. It was strategy. He was testing me, testing if I carried my mother's strength, testing if the truth mattered more to me than a false peace. And I passed the test. Chidinma had nowhere to go. Her credibility, built on years of smiles and expensive dresses and public performances, crumbled in a matter of minutes. The relatives who once admired her now looked at her with suspicion. The women who envied her position now whispered among themselves, recontextualizing every moment, every story, every interaction through the lens of the exposed truth. She stood up, tried to maintain some dignity, but her movements were uncoordinated, hurried. Her jeans slipped slightly, revealing messy hair underneath. She muttered something about needing air and left the room. No one followed her. I remained standing, documents still in hand, my heart beating like an ancestral drum. Around me, the relatives began to speak. Not in defense of Chidinma, not questioning my truth, but in acknowledgement, in shame for having believed, in a commitment to honor my mother's memory properly. My father made a small gesture calling me over. I walked to him. He didn't stand, but reached out and took my hand, those weathered fingers gripping mine firmly. "Your mother's proud," he whispered, "and so am I." The tears came then, not from sadness, from relief, from knowing I wasn't alone, from love for a man I'd almost stopped believing in. "Thank you for letting me speak," I replied. He squeezed my hand tighter. "You didn't need permission, Amara. Truth doesn't ask. But you needed to know you weren't standing alone. And you never were." The relatives around us began to disperse. Some came up to me, apologizing for having doubted, for having accepted the lies so easily. Others went to my mother's photograph in the ancestral room, paying their respects as they should have done all along. The room slowly emptied. My father remained seated, looking out the window at the yard where the late afternoon light painted everything gold. I sat beside him in silence. Chidinma didn't return to the room. I could hear her somewhere in the house, her voice muffled, probably on the phone, trying to do damage control, trying to find some narrative that would save her. But there was no narrative possible. Not against the documented truth. Not against the validation of the man whose opinion mattered most in that house. "What happens now?" I asked my father. He kept watching the yard, his voice quiet and steady. "Now the truth's alive. Your mother's honored again, and Chidinma knows that lies don't survive in this house." "Is she staying?" My father sighed, a long, heavy sound. "That's her choice, but she's lost her power here. Her voice doesn't shape our story anymore. She can stay as a wife if she chooses to be humble, but never again as someone who rewrites truth." It was fair. More than she deserved, perhaps. But my father was always a man of mercy, tempered with justice. We sat together as the sun went down. For the first time in years, I felt my mother was present. Not as a ghost, but as a legacy. Alive through the truth I had defended. Alive through the strength she taught me to carry. And in the shine of my father's eyes, I saw the reflection of that love he never let die. He just kept it safe, protected it, waited for the right moment to validate it. That moment had arrived. And the truth finally breathed freely. The truth, when it finally breathed freely, had a weight of its own. It wasn't light. It didn't bring instant relief. But it had substance, like stone set on a solid foundation. And in that sunset, sitting beside my father in the silence of the ancestral yard, I felt for the first time in years that the ground beneath me was real. His words still echoed. "Continue." 2 syllables that had turned the world upside down. Or rather, that had put the world back in its right place. But the truth, as my mother used to say, doesn't end when it's spoken. It needs to be witnessed. It needs to find fertile ground. And that night, as the community elders dispersed from the yard, their eyes held something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. Not for what I had destroyed, but for what I had preserved. Grandma Nkiru was the first to approach. Her wrinkled hand touched my head with the silent blessing of the elders. She didn't need to say anything. The gesture was ancestral, an acknowledgement that I had honored not just my mother, but the entire lineage of women who came before us. After her came others. Uncle Emeka, who had witnessed when Chidinma twisted the story for the first time. Aunt Adaeze, who wept silently when the truth about the lands was revealed. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, but who now remembered why my visits had become so rare. And Chidinma. She remained seated on the other side of the yard like a pillar of salt. Her elaborate jeel, once a symbol of manufactured authority, now seemed like just too much cloth for too small a head. The expensive fabrics she always used to buy respect hung lifelessly on her slumped shoulders. No one confronted her directly. There were no shouts. There were no public accusations beyond those I had made myself, documents in hand. But there was something far more devastating happening. The social silence. That invisible death that happens when a community decides, collectively, that you no longer exist in the way you did before. The women who once fawned over her now spoke in circles that didn't include her. The men who once listened to her opinions now turned their backs when she approached. Not out of cruelty, but for something much simpler. She had revealed herself to be false. And in a community built on ancestral truths, falsehood has no foundation. I watched all this with mixed feelings. Part of me, the part that still carried the wounded girl I was, felt a grim satisfaction. Justice being served, scores being settled. But there was another part. The part my mother had cultivated in me with her stories of compassion and balanced strength that felt something more complex. Not pity, exactly, but a recognition that the destruction I was witnessing was the destruction Chidinma had built with her own hands. She wasn't expelled. No one asked her to leave. But what happened was, in some ways, more profound. She remained, but as a shadow of what she tried to be. The authority she had claimed through lies evaporated like mist under a strong sun. And my father? He watched everything with those eyes that always saw more than they seemed to. When the last visitor finally left, and only the three of us remained on the property, he finally spoke the words I didn't know I needed to hear. Amara, come with me. We went to the ancestral room, that sacred space where the photographs of those who came before us kept silent witness to our lives. My mother's photo was still there, but displaced, pushed to the side by newer arrangements Chidinma had made. Subtle changes that, over time, had rewritten the visual geography of our family history. My father stopped in front of that wall and stood in silence for a time that seemed to stretch beyond normal measure. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of unspoken years. I saw everything, Amara. All the little lies, all the subtle distortions. I saw when she started moving things, changing the stories, rewriting who your mother was. Why didn't you say anything? The question came out before I could hold it back. It wasn't an accusation. It was a need to understand. He turned to me, and in that aged face, I saw something he had never allowed me to see before. Vulnerability, pain so deep it hadn't yet found a bottom. Because I was drowning, daughter. When your mother left, part of me left with her. And I didn't know how to keep being the head of the family, being a father, being a man of respect in the community when inside I was empty. Chidinma offered to fill that void. And I, coward that I was, let her. I let her, because it was easier than facing the pain. I let her because I thought silence was peace. He touched the frame of my mother's photo with fingers that trembled slightly. But silence isn't peace, Amara. It's just delayed noise. And every time I saw you shrink when Chidinma spoke, every time I saw you avoid this house, every time I noticed your visits getting shorter, rarer, more tense, I knew. I knew my silence was costing more than my pain ever would. So why now? Why continue? Because you reminded me of who I was before I lost myself. You were there, with those documents your mother kept, with that truth your mother valued, being exactly the daughter your mother raised. And I realized that if I remained silent one more time, I wouldn't just be betraying you. I would be betraying her. I would be betraying everything we built together. Tears flowed freely down his face now, that face of a chief, of an elder, of a man who always maintained public composure. But there, in that sacred space, He was just a broken man who had finally found the courage to admit he was broken. I failed you, Amara. I failed to protect you when you needed it. I failed to honor your mother's memory when it was my sacred duty to do so, and I don't have enough words to ask for forgiveness for that. He turned to me completely, that proud man I had only ever seen bow to the elders, and he bowed to me. But I am asking, not as your father claiming birthright, but as a man who failed, asking for mercy from a woman who proved stronger than he ever was. Something broke inside me at that moment. Not painfully, but like a dam finally giving way, releasing waters that had been held back for too long. I gripped my father's shoulders and pulled him back to an upright position. You don't need to bow to me, Father. You never will. But I need you to stand tall. I need you to be who you always were. Not the man lost in grief, but the man my mother loved. The man she trusted to guard her truth, even when she was no longer here to defend it. We stood there, holding each other in a way we hadn't since I was a child, too young to understand that adults break too. In that embrace, something broken started coming together again. When we finally let go, he turned to the wall and began systematically undoing Chidinma's rearrangements. He moved my mother's photograph back to center. Around it, he placed photos of her ancestors, the lineage Chidinma had tried to erase. Then, he did something that surprised me. He picked up one of my recent photos from when I defended my thesis at university and placed it beside my mother's. 2 generations of women who guarded the truth. This is the real story of this family, he said. This is the truth that will be told from now on. And Chidinma? I asked, knowing the question was necessary. He sighed, a deep sound coming from a weary place. She remains, not out of merit, but because this house still has room for mercy. But she remains stripped of the authority she tried to claim through falsehood. She remains a member of the family, but not the guardian of its history. That responsibility, he looked at me with an intensity that brooked no doubt, is now yours. Guardian of history. The role my mother had held. The legacy Chidinma wanted to take. Now it was mine, not just by birth, but by choice. For standing when it would have been easier to stay silent. For speaking when silence would have been safer. In the weeks that followed, the transformation in the house was subtle but profound. Chidinma moved through the spaces like a ghost of herself. She was not mistreated. She was not excluded from meals or daily routines. But the dynamic had changed irreversibly. When she spoke, no one hung on her words as before. When she offered an opinion, it was met with the kind of polite courtesy one offers to strangers, not with the deference she had grown accustomed to receiving. And she knew. I saw in her eyes that she knew exactly what she had lost. The question was what she would do with that knowledge. Whether she would choose genuine humility or just a more careful simulation. But that was her choice to make, not mine to monitor. My responsibility was now different. I began to spend more time in the ancestral room, organizing documents my mother had kept, recording stories my father was finally ready to tell, connecting with distant cousins and aunts and uncles to gather the narratives that, together, formed the complete fabric of our family history. And I discovered something unexpected in this process. It wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about creating a foundation for the future. For the children yet to come, who would need to know where they came from? Who would need to understand that truth, even when it comes at a high cost, is always worth more than comfort bought with lies. One afternoon, I found Chidinma at the ancestral room door, watching me work. We stared at each other across the space that had grown between us. You won, she said finally, her voice flat, stripped of its usual sweetness. You got what you wanted. I didn't win anything, I said, and meant it. This wasn't a game. You tried to erase my mother. I made sure she stayed visible. That's not victory. That's justice. She made a sound that could have been a laugh or could have been a sob, hard to distinguish. Justice, she said bitterly. That's what you're calling it. You did this to yourself, I said simply. I just refused to be destroyed with you. We fell silent after that. There was nothing more to say. She eventually walked away, and I returned to the work of cataloging old letters my mother had written to relatives. Words from a woman who knew she would be remembered not for what she possessed, but for what she preserved. My father came back to life. Not instantly. There were still days when grief hit hard. But he didn't disappear into it anymore. He learned to carry pain with grace, understanding that some wounds are sacred, while others just destroy you. He started taking me to elder meetings. He'd introduce me formally as the family's historian, and I saw in their faces that they understood. Something important had shifted. An old order restored. The way we'd handled this crisis showed what we valued. Grandmother Nkiru called me aside one morning. She took me to her backyard, where she kept a medicinal herb garden that was legendary in the region. "Your mother visited me," she said, and I didn't need her to explain. In our culture, the living and dead aren't separated the way they are in others. What did she say? That she's proud, that you carry her name and her spirit, and that the real inheritance a mother leaves isn't property. It's the strength to defend truth when the world wants silence. The tears came freely there in that garden, where plants and wisdom grow alongside each other. Grandmother Nkiru touched my cheek with a hand that smelled of basil and wisdom. "Keep being who you are, Amara. Keep being the bridge between what was and what will be. That is your responsibility now, and it is a sacred responsibility." I created a routine that honored that responsibility. Mornings at the university, teaching African literature to students who needed to understand their own stories mattered. Afternoons in the ancestral room, documenting my family's history before it could be lost. And on one specific afternoon, when the sun hit at exactly the same angle it had on that day when everything had changed, I did something I had planned for weeks. I removed my mother's photograph from the wall, but not to hide it or diminish it. I took it to be professionally restored, framed in fine wood that my father had kept from a special tree he and my mother planted together on their wedding day. The restoration was beautiful, more than preserved honored. When I hung it in the center of the ancestral room with a new plaque beneath it listing her name and all she'd given the family and community, something in me settled. My father was there when I did it. He touched the frame like it was sacred. "She's home," he whispered. "She never left," I said. "We just forgot to see her." That night, we sat together in the backyard as we had done on that transformative day. But now there was no tension in the air. There were no unspoken secrets or repressed truths. There was only the peace that comes when debts are settled and foundations are restored. Chidinma was living diminished, broken by her own lies. She wasn't a threat anymore. Not even an adversary. Just a woman who made choices and now lived with the fallout. Me? I was a guardian. Not just of papers and photographs. Guardian of truth itself. Guardian of my father's restored dignity. Guardian of a legacy for generations not yet born. That's what love demands. We don't just live our own lives. We protect the stories of those who came before. We refuse to let them be rewritten for profit, or erased for ambition. We keep the light burning, no matter how hard the winds try to extinguish it. That night under those ancient stars, I finally got what my mother had been teaching me all along. Truth isn't just facts. It's about character. It's about standing firm when it's easier to collapse. It's about honoring the dead through action, not just words. When my father said, "Go on," he wasn't just telling me to speak. He was passing the responsibility forward, making it my job to carry what they'd built and transform it into something that would outlive us all. My mother's photograph sits in the place of honor now, not hidden, not diminished, not rewritten, just true. And when I look at it, I see more than just her face. I see a witness. I see a standard. I see proof that truth and integrity matter more than anything else ever could. Truth came alive that day, not just spoken lived, in every story I preserved, in my father's reclaimed dignity, in the community's restored respect, in the legacy we guard. That's what justice really is. Not revenge, not destruction, restoration. Truth finding its rightful place, honor going to whom it's due. History told the way it should have been told all along. Under those stars, with my father beside me and generations of ancestors watching, I felt my mother there. Not as a ghost, as a living legacy, in every truth preserved, in every story honored, in every choice we make to keep her alive. The fight was finished. Justice was served. And finally, the truth came home.